Good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. I am really happy to see that we have 37 participants already signed in, 38, 39 still coming, to talk about a number of rule packages. We've got 5 things to go through today. A couple of them you've seen before, and some of them are new. I just want to start off by saying it is always my goal with rule packages that we talk about them enough and have enough communication before they are even proposed, that by the time we get to the proposal stage, we don't really have any more kinks to work out. So I really appreciate your early and avid participation and communicating with me, and especially folks who are sending me email questions. That's really helpful to give us the time to really work through the issues that you're having. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for continuing to pay attention, even though there's a million other things going on. We really do appreciate it. With that said, we'll go ahead and get started with our agenda. Item number 1, we'll be looking at, again, the new rules for protests of license and permit applications. We're doing a lot of changes to Chapter 33, so we're not exactly sure what the subchapter will actually be, so there's going to be some rearrangement. These rules have not changed significantly, if at all, I think, since the May stakeholder meeting. So I'm just going to leave the floor open if there are questions or comments about these rules. If there are none, these will be going to the commission, I believe, at the next meeting for proposal. With that said, does anyone have any comments or questions about the protest of license and permit application rules and license processing rules? We're up to 50 participants. If you have any questions, you'll need to type them into the group chat or send them to me, and then I'll read them aloud and attempt to respond here or get back to you if I don't have an answer for you right now. Question coming in, is there a deadline after a SOA ruling for TABC to make a decision? I'm thinking of the APA. I don't believe there is, but generally speaking, I believe we would put it on the next available agenda. I can't see why we would not do that. That's something that we might want to look into adding to the rule. So I'll discuss that. It can be added to the rule. So let me take that to the group, and we'll potentially add that to the rule. I'd also need to make sure that there's nothing in the APA about that. Good question, thank you. How do you give a refund for a conditional permit when statute lays out refunds and this is not covered? Okay, let me look at the conditional approval. So essentially, the conditional approval would go away, and then it would just be like a regular application. If it's rejected, if it's not granted, it would just be like a regular application. So the conditional approval it's not a refund of the conditional approval. It's a refund based on the application itself being denied. Okay, there's a concern being raised. Past administrations have said that you cannot give a permit type that does not exist in the statute. Okay, thank you for that input. We will take that into consideration. I think the idea here is not that it's a different permit type, but it's the same permit. It's just sort of a temporary conditional approval until that 10-day period or 15-day period lapses. So it's technically not a different type of permit. It's just a different sort of a temporary approval of the same type of permit. So going back to the first question, the deadline for a SOA ruling after, for TABC to make a decision after the SOA ruling is, according to the Administrative Procedure Act, is 60 days. So that means, because of our schedule, commission hearing schedule, that will probably mean it must be on the next commission agenda, since we only meet every other month. There's a concern being raised that computation of time before approval is crazy when we have no idea when the application will be posted to some kind of public inquiry. Is the public supposed to check the inquiry every day? That's the only public-facing way that we have to notify people that an application has been received and is complete. If you have ideas for another way we could do that, we'd be willing to look into that. What we're working with right now is implementing the new project management, essentially, system that will have a lot of tools for the public to use to make it easier for them to see what's going on. We don't have any other, you know, the other way we could do it would be to publish in a newspaper, but no one looks at those either. So it's kind of a common problem for agencies with license and permit applications, that it's difficult to make sure the public knows at every step of the way. But we think that the online system that we're implementing should be an easy way for people to check anyway, easier than looking in the back of a newspaper or something like that. But if you have any other ideas, we'd be happy to hear them, of course. Is the Commission working on determining dates for when applications will be considered submitted by licensing so that timelines can be determined? Yes, this is something that we've been talking about. It's on our radar, and as a matter of internal procedure. And again, this is something that's working with the implementation of the new AIM system. We are working on ways to ensure that span of time is as short as possible, and we're doing that as efficiently as possible, and there aren't any unnecessary delays. So we are aware of the concern, and we are working on it as a matter of internal procedures to make sure that there's no delays there. Amy Harrison has concerns about not being able to give answers about a system we don't have a handle on. We're having to, because of our deadlines that the legislature's given us, we're having to both adopt new rules based upon Sunset Commission directives and also adopt this new system, this new computer system at the same time, and it is a challenge. It's been a big challenge for us, and I know it's a challenge for you all as well. There are a lot of things that the timing isn't matching up, so it is definitely a struggle. We are doing the best we can, and we are, as always, looking for ways to do it better. We may have to request extensions of deadlines, and that is something that's under consideration, of course. Okay, that's fine.
Do we have like a raise your hand process?
Okay.
Maybe you announce it first.
Okay, so I'm being told, Joe here from IT is telling me that we can unmute individual people if they wish to speak. So the way that would work would be for someone who wants to speak rather than typing your question, just to type in that you want to speak, and then we can unmute you, and you can speak to the group. So that might be easier than all of the typing. So just raise your hand if you would like to be called upon, and we will unmute you for the group. Okay, Amy Harrison would like to be unmuted. Okay, I believe your microphone is on, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Let's turn up our volume a little bit here. Okay.
Is that better?
Yes, excellent.
Gosh, thank you very, very much. And my apologies. You know, you can never convey things in words. It's a lot like emails. You sound like a real jerk when you really don't want to sound like a jerk. And so my apologies. I certainly don't mean to sound that way. And that's why I think there's a lot to be said about just plain conversation. Many administrations before have tried to do a conditional permit, and past general counsels, as well as many of the smart people that are on this call, have said that you cannot create something that the statute doesn't give you permission to create. And so you're creating a conditional permit that then you're going to revoke if I don't comply. How do you revoke something that you gave me, that you made conditional, when the statute doesn't say it's conditional? The statute doesn't allow for a conditional permit. There is a topic file. Some of the folks that are on this call called it my squirrel file, but it has a whole record of conditional permits and discussions that have been had with many people about whether this was an allowable privilege of the commission. Now, perhaps with sunset and with new administration, you can pick and choose what you pay attention to. But I don't know, and I guess my biggest concerns are the fact that we're trying to speak to Texans that can understand us, and this is so complicated. Even the computation of time as to when my permit will be issued, what day do I count, what day do I not count? I deal with people every single day that don't read these rules, and they don't understand. And I draw a lot of pictures every day. And I'm going to have to draw a picture for every client to show them when they're going to be eligible to be issued.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Also, management reviews. A permit or license holder may not be surrendered its existing permit or license while it's subject to a management review. I don't think the commission can tell an applicant when they can cancel or turn in their permit. because the TABC has made a decision that I'm under management review, but as a permit holder, I don't have an opportunity to be heard about my management review, so I'm not allowed to turn in the privilege. The permit's a privilege. If I want to turn it in, I should have the ability as a permit holder to do that. And yet, if I'm under a management review that I don't understand, I've never had an opportunity to discuss with the commission or even dispute, and you tell me I can't turn in my permit. I have some real issues with these rules, as you can tell.
Let me respond to the first concern about conditional permits. So
Right.
the idea behind this one is that the only condition is that there are no valid protests filed within the 15-day period following the completion and essentially the internal approval of the application. And that's to allow that 15 days for someone who is not the applicant to take a look at the application and have time to file a protest. That's the only condition there would be. If no one files a valid protest, no one withstanding or someone that, they'd have to raise a justiciable issue. If nothing like that is filed, it would be issued. And it's also, the idea behind it is that it would be used in very rare circumstances where there's some sort of compelling reason and it would be an executive director level decision to invoke it. And for whatever reason, there needs to be needs to be issued before that 15 days is up. So it's not that we would be conditioning it on, several different things. It's just on waiting out that 15 days. And we would expect it to be used only very, very rarely and only at the decision of the executive director or his deputy, and not on a regular basis and not as decided by a member of the licensing staff. And I know that doesn't totally respond to your concerns, but I hope that clarifies a little bit what we're trying to do there. As far as management review, I know part of the problem there is that when there's a management review that requires investigation, if someone surrenders their license during that time period, we essentially lose the ability to, or we lose a lot of our ability to enforce any violations that might come out of that investigation. So I believe that's the primary concern there, but I will discuss that further with our enforcement folks and see if I can't get you some additional clarification on that. I do certainly understand your concern.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a suggestion that the public website have a spot for date of first publication such that anyone checking on any given day knows how many days have elapsed and how many we have to go. Using the public website, and especially in a very visible way, I think is a good idea, especially before we can implement the AIMS computer system. That's an implementation idea that we will definitely give strong consideration. The question is, if a protest that says the 60-day sign was not posted for 60 days, what happens? That is a good question. I don't know the answer to it. Yeah, we'd have to investigate and determine if that's, that's a matter of notice. So if they have standing, that sounds like a justiciable issue, obviously within our jurisdiction. So that's something that would have to be investigated. I think if a competitor was the protestant, first of all, competitor, unless would not have standing to protest a permit under our new rules unless they live within a certain distance of the business. So we are not going to, if they live in the neighborhood and are a competitor, then that's possible that they could abuse that, and we would investigators would be able to take, obviously take into consideration the credibility of the allegation, and then go out, do some investigating and see if that's the case or not. Yeah, competitor abuse of protests is again, it's a problem for every licensing agency. It's also a problem for TDLR and competitors filing grievances against each other. So it's just something that we're going to have to be vigilant, and our investigators are going to have to be aware of the problem, and that they might be that if the person is a competitor, that it might be a tactic. And we'll have to just do our best to decrease the delays, do the investigation as quickly as possible, determine if it's a competitor attempting to slow things down, and not become part of the problem on that. And of course, if it's someone that's repeatedly doing such things, I think that we'll be able to, move pretty quickly past such protests. The question is, unless otherwise indicated, an application shall be subject to the rules in effect as of the date it was received. And the question is, when is it received? We have the new rule that we are adopting for receipt is when the application is complete. So in other words, it's not received if you file one page and don't pay the fee and don't file and don't respond to requests for additional information, and maybe you don't file a premises diagram. We have to have everything, every piece of it that we need in hand, including the fee, to be considered complete. That doesn't mean that it has to be reviewed, but granted, but it just has to be the pieces of information that are required need to be in hand here at the agency. So they should know when it's received, because they will get a notification. They should be in constant contact, I'm assuming, with their license processing staff member, and will know when they have responded adequately to all of their requests for information, and there are no additional requests for information. And at that point, there will be something marked in the system that shows that that's done, and that's something that's part of our written procedures, internal procedures, that has to be done, right away upon receipt of the final piece of information or fee or whatever it is, that you go into the system and you mark it as received. That's part of a very detailed process documents that we are in the process of creating right now. That should be, the date received per the rule should be the same as the date received. I'm not sure what the date received when filed means, but the date that the agency receives the last piece of information we need to make it a complete application will also be the same date. On that same date will be marked in the system to show, and that's how you will know that it's complete. And the idea is to make this as efficient as possible so that there isn't any delay between the receipt of the last piece of information and the marking of received in the system and getting that information to you. There's nothing, it's a simple toggle toggle switch computer function for the staff member, and it is something that you can see immediately on your dashboard when you log in. So that's the idea there. Okay, and Amy is raising her hand.
I'm so sorry. I'm just confused, and everybody on here knows that happens often. So unless otherwise indicated, an application for a license or permit shall be subject to the rules in effect as of the date the application is received. So you just described internal processes and a dashboard that we don't know anything about. So is that in the internal process? I know that the application was dropped off on May 1st. Your public system that's going to say application received, I do not know what day that's going to appear. So on the day I file my application, I have no understanding about what rules apply to me. Do the old rules apply to me, or do the new rules apply to me? Because I don't know what day I'm going to pop up on the internal system. So that's my question. If it can be clearly articulated so that at least somebody that a poor applicant's paying can try to understand what are they subject to upon their filing. It's very confusing. I'm sorry.
So if it's before, are you concerned about what happens before the dashboard is available to you, or
I'm
that you
concerned
don't?
about what happens before the dashboard's available, what happens before this system's created and yet this rule goes into effect. And now all of us as stakeholders have agreed to something when we have no understanding of the basic principle of what does it mean for the application receive date. You're holding all the cards, and the public is going to be in the dark, or it would appear so, until a day certain that the commission decides to row it up on a web page. And they're going to have to check every day to know, what day am I on? Is the system going to have a counter on it? And I want to be issued before my 15 days because I've been pending for 75. So I make an appeal. What are the guidelines for an appeal for the administrator to make a decision about whether I'm available before my 15 days are up or after my 15 days are up? And do I have an appeal for that situation? The administrator doesn't decide that I'm obliged to get before my 15 days. Yet I do, I believe I do. How does that happen? Who gets up before the 15 days and who doesn't? I'm sorry. I just deal with a lot of people every day that don't understand this, and this is just exceptionally complicated for just the filing of an application and to understand what day you even were considered to be received.
So before the system goes into effect, it will be a matter of just notice from the person who's processing your application that they've received everything they need. That's your receive date. After the system is in effect, it will be the date that they click that button, which should be the same day. There shouldn't be any difference. And it should be the same day that they receive the last piece of information they've requested that they need for a complete application. As far as the conditional appeal, that's something that, again, we're anticipating will be very, very rarely used, not conditional appeal, conditional permitting, and that it is entirely at the discretion of the executive director for whatever reasons, and there is no right to a conditional permit and there is no appeal. So that's the way that is written right now, just to answer your questions.
So there's no guidance for and I apologize, there's no guidance for the public as to when the administrator may use his discretion. I mean, we're talking about the issuance of a permit, and it's not issuance basically for 15 days. And I would hope that the administrator would have guidelines that the public understood with transparency about what his guidelines are for its early approval versus its not early approval. When does somebody get to go early versus not? And I know you think it's not going to be used very often, but I can promise you that anybody that sees their application up and they know there's a discretionary for the 15 days, they're going to ask you. I promise. I'm going to ask you for every one of my clients. That's my job. And anybody that's being paid to work an application that didn't do it, I would say isn't doing their job. Thank you.
That's a good point. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on any part of the Chapter 33 protest, license, application review and protest rules at this time? Or if you would prefer just to type into the group chat, please feel free to do that as well. And as always, if you have something that you'd like to discuss with me off of the group, I'm always available. You can email me at shana.horton@tabc.texas.gov, or I also check the rules at tabc.texas.gov email box, and I'm always happy to take your phone calls as well. Okay. With that said, it looks like there are no other comments at this moment on item number 1. So if we could move to item number 2. This is another one that you have seen before if you've been participating. This is our new method for evaluating and determining sanctions for regulatory violations, non-public safety violations, and it will replace the current Rule 34.3. It involves a rule that lays out base penalties for a variety of regulatory violations, as well as a penalty policy, which is separate from the rule, but that the rule requires the agency to follow. Finally, there is also a worksheet that's associated with the methodology that will be used by agency staff members to essentially show their work as to how they have determined the appropriate amount of penalty for a regulatory violation. That's something that will be part of the information that respondents are given when they are notified, when they get their notice of violation. So we have discussed this at the last couple of meetings, but it is it's kind of a lot. It's a new sort of way of thinking of things, or way of showing things. It's actually not a new way of thinking of things. It's not intended to change things. It's intended to show what we've been doing. The primary change that it comes from the legislature, which has instructed us to take into account any additional profits that are gained due to a regulatory violation when assessing the penalty, to ensure that the penalty is actually punitive and it doesn't become just a business decision to violate our rules because it turns out that it will make you enough money to make it worthwhile. So we're trying to sort of make that not the calculation anymore by recouping any profits from the violation. That's the main actual change that may result in some higher penalties. As for the rest, it's essentially we're just trying to show our work on how we've really been doing it all along, but it's been done sort of just internally without a lot of transparency. So we're trying to open up that black box and show you what we're thinking, and that's a starting point for negotiation. With that said, if there are any comments and questions on the sanctions for regulatory violations, one thing I did want to mention, at our last discussion on this, there was some concern that there are some citations that occur both in Rule 34.2 for public safety violations and also in 34.3 for regulatory violations, the same statutory citation. The issue there is that, as you all know, there are a lot of statutory citations for place and manner that can encompass a wide variety of conduct. Some of that conduct, depending on severity of it, or depending maybe on the consequences on what has happened as a result, may be more of a public safety issue, or if there was no physical harm or anything like that, it might be more of a regulatory violation, and those can fall under those same statutory citations. The concern there is, okay, well, if you've got them under both, then are you going to penalize us under both? And of course, that's not our intention. But at the same time, it would be very difficult for us to, in some way, try to imagine all of the different scenarios that could fall under those statutes and parse them out into different categories. I think that would be a fool's errand. And so instead, what I've done to try to address that concern is I have added into the penalty policy a statement that essentially acknowledges that these can fall under more than one. They could either fall under the public safety matrix or the regulatory matrix, and is our intention to only use one or the other and not both for any particular incident of conduct. So that has been added to the penalty policy since our last discussion. Everything else remains the same. Amy Harrison's asking, when are they scheduled to be before the board? Are you asking about the penalty policy or all of them? Okay. Let's see. I believe both of these are intended to be up for proposal in July. So at our next meeting, yes. Thanks, Marianne. And remember, if you'd prefer to speak rather than typing, just say raising my hand, and we'll unmute you.
Hi, this is Rot from the Texas Craft Brewers Guild. I have a question about how things land in this new penalty matrix there, and I'll use an example that's near and dear to the craft brewer's heart. For a beer-to-go violation, in the previous rule book, there was a gradual increase in severity of the penalty if the violation lasts over a certain amount of days, or is a recurrence. In the new matrix, that same penalty seems to be in the most severe column to the very far right, suggesting it's something that could impede the entire operation of the three-tier system, or the alcoholic beverage industry in Texas. And it's unclear to me how things land in there, especially since you said this is the base penalty. So at least that rule started with a minimum penalty that's not listed in the new matrix, and you're starting with the highest severity of the rule. Is that how do the gradual penalties get reflected in the new matrix?
Okay, that's a really helpful comment. So when we were the team was deciding which column to put each type of violation in, it's kind of described in the penalty policy how we did that. But we're also really open to people saying, hey, we think this one's miscategorized. And so what I would encourage you to do is to just shoot me an email that says, I think this one's miscategorized. It used to be the base penalty was whatever it would be for the not continuing violation, but one violation. And that's something we can reconsider, whether that should be maybe categorized in a lower category. As to the second part of your question, as far as the ongoing nature of it and the escalating penalty amounts, that's taken care of, or that consideration comes in. You would have a base penalty and then a number of violation events. So if it's going on for, several days at a time, you could have a separate violation event for each day. And that's how that it would increase. So it's a multiplier. Also, if it's a pattern of conduct over time, in other words, this is something that's happening year over year, that can be what's called an aggravating factor that we can apply a multiplier for essentially just a conduct of disregard for the rules. So there are two ways, but I think really the whole sort of stepwise increasing of the penalty would be done by the number of violation events multiplier. But I really do, and for all of those categorizations, if you have a disagreement with how, with which column a particular violation falls into, please let me know, and we will take a second look. We're definitely interested in your responses on that. Has this rule been given to an agent for their impression or comprehension? Yes. So we've actually had some folks, a select group of folks in audit that actually used the policy and the worksheets and just in tandem with what their current practices are, and ran several cases that have already been closed using the new system, and some cases that they're working on. And we made some adjustments based on that, but we were really gratified to find that it actually really worked, and came out, the penalties came out where we would expect them to, where they would have under the method that they're using now, that's just internal only and doesn't have this external forward-facing component. The only difference, the only ones that weren't essentially very close or the same in penalty amount were ones where we would be considering the amount of profit under that new authority from the legislature. And those, of course, were higher under the new authority. Oh, we did work an example last time. I don't think we're set up to do it this time. But what I can do is I can email, if anyone wants me to email some to you, some samples, I can do that, and then we can follow up by phone. We ran a couple of them on our last stakeholder meeting, and I'd definitely be happy to send those out and discuss them with anyone that wants to talk about them, and I'll definitely send them to you, Ms. Harrison. We are also, to that concern, we're also going to be, if this does get adopted, we will be rolling this out with a great deal of training. Obviously, with all these rule changes, there will be training in every sector of the agency to get people up to speed on the new rules. And this penalty protocol will be subject to training that involves workbooks. We're developing workbooks, and we definitely want, and there will also be review at a management level so that we can make sure that as we start using this, that that people are using it correctly and that we are being consistent across the various regions and how it's being used. We don't have any plans for a public training, but it's the workbooks I suppose would be public information. So those training materials I'm not the public information expert here, but the training materials I believe might be okay. Workbooks could be posted on. I think that's something we could definitely consider doing. I don't see why that would be prohibited. Again, this is all about transparency, so I want everyone to see how we're using them. I mean, everyone to understand how the worksheets work, so, your ideas for getting everyone, up to speed on that are welcome. We have Marcus Schwartz.
I don't see that he has a phone.
You don't appear to have a phone link or a microphone linked right now, Mr. Schwartz.
Oh, okay, hold on. Page 549.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, what are the last four digits of your phone number? I think we're just seeing your phone number. If you can scroll up.
It's at 549-8901.
5409, okay. I think it's up higher.
Hey, Shana, can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
Thank you, and thank you, IT person in the background. Appreciate it.
Yes, that was great.
So, I guess my first thing is I just want to make clear that agents still have discretion in issuing warnings and the people on the ground and the like as they do today, and these aren't automatic penalties, correct?
We're still developing, the agents will have discretion, but we're still developing what that's going to look like as far as the number of warnings for certain violations. I know that's something that's under discussion. The legislature has instructed us not to reconsider giving multiple warnings for things like cash credit violations. But there will always be complete discretion about the calculation of the penalty.
Understood. Thank you. And your point, Shannon, when you were speaking about some of these versus regulatory versus health and safety is well taken. We do appreciate that, that you won't, potentially go both and you'll choose as appropriate. One question on the franchise and hotel tax failures. I see that on here. I've never known that to be an issue for TABC, and I've certainly never seen a fine from TABC for that. That's the comptroller's area. The comptroller will fine people for that, and I'm just wondering the thought behind that, and even where, I guess, your authority to do that is. I know in the code you're allowed to do Chapter 183 taxation penalties, but that's not franchise or hotel taxes.
Okay, I'm getting some feedback from Thomas Graham over here. So that's something we're probably need to follow up with you on. Go ahead and say what you think.
Yeah, Marcus, let us follow up with you on that. I think we need to talk with audit and then look at some of those. I can't remember if that's a part of the legislative change, but I know audit's doing a different process for some of that, so I can't speak to it.
Understood. I'm somewhat worried just about double jeopardy for some clients there, frankly, but anyway, we can talk about that offline.
Okay, that sounds good.
Another one is applicant not qualified. That's under 1,000 on, I think, the second page. And who are we saying is applicant? Are we saying that if someone applies for a permit and is denied, are they gonna be fined?
No, can you give me?
Because there's things for renewals, like failures of renewals, but those make sense for existing permittees, but that one just said applicant, so. And
Okay.
the rules, authorities are kind of vague in what it's asking, so I was just curious as to the thought behind and what that represents.
Yeah, that might be a subterfuge situation. Again, let me follow up and see. Well, there's subterfuge about that. Let me follow up and see. Yeah, miscellaneous violations. Let's see, applicant not qualified. Yeah, let me follow up with the folks who crafted this list and see what that means. We need to clarify that. What's that?
Oh.
That it definitely needs some clarification as to what we're talking about there, because obviously we wouldn't find someone just for filing an application and determining that they are disqualified for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, one of the thoughts behind there, just to give you an idea, is sometimes applicants won't even know they're unqualified. For instance, they might not know that their landlord has a 3-tier violation. And so I certainly don't think that should be on them. And I know that's not your current practice and wouldn't think it's here, but I'm just curious as to the
Yeah, I
thought
think it's
process.
just, I think it's just poorly, I think it's just not worded in a descriptive way. So we just need to get a better descriptor there, and we'll follow up with you on that as well.
And
Who's? Dexter?
About those two.
Does he want to talk?
It's up to you. But if we need to, we can do stuff like that. Or we can come back to it.
How many excise bonds are still on file? Right now, we don't have any. I believe we talked about this the other day.
We're actually reworking that rule
Right
right now, so we'll have some drafts out here in the near future.
Literally reworking that over the last 2 weeks, the bonds rules. So there will be clarification forthcoming.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you will see it. It will go. It will go through. It's a rulemaking proceeding. So we're in the phase of drafting right now, and then it will come before you for stakeholder meetings, just like everything else. So you'll be seeing all of that. But we're rethinking the excise tax bonds at the same time as we are just sort of cleaning up and reconfiguring the performance and conduct surety bonds. All of it will go through the full. I don't think that it will change it's not going to be any like substantive changes. It's a reorganization. There might be some changes in implementation that aren't necessarily in rule. And I don't think it changes the citation, the statutory citation, and the existence of a violation for bond violations. We wouldn't change anything that would require a change to statute without the legislature instructing us to do that. So the statutory citations will definitely hold on that. Okay. And anyone else want to raise their hand or ask a question? If you would like copies of some worked through examples of the penalty calculation worksheets, please shoot me an email. I'll be happy. Failure to pay local fees. $11.38, $61.36. There's a question about how we handled failure to pay local fees. I do not know the answer to that question. I will have to talk with enforcement about that, and I will get back to you. I don't know how each one of these violations is handled in the field. If they are paid, okay, Daryl, I'm sorry, Dexter. Dexter has an answer to your question. We're going to unmute him so he can respond.
Can you hear me?
There you are.
Yeah, I'm not sure who asked the question about the local fees, but if you're relating to county and city, I presume you're relating to county and city fees. So those folks normally notify us that the fees have not been paid, and depending on again, if it's taxes and other local fees, we have the ability to either suspend the permit and or cancel the permit, give notice as a warning folks initially for those folks to make payment to the city or county. And after a certain period of time, if they have not made the payment, follow up with the city and county and then take the appropriate action. Like I said, depending on, whether it's fees or taxes, we have the ability by statute to suspend and or cancel the permit.
Okay.
Dexter, it's Amy. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Okay?
Yes.
So this is a good example. Harris County has recently gone back and redone their billings, and they're collecting for first year as well as second and third year at the same time. And they show that first year's delinquent, although none of their permit holders ever received the first notice. So I'm going through billings right now for my clients that have, some are accurate, some are inaccurate. And I'm finding out that due to the legislation last session that enabled cities and counties to come together and hire their own collection agency, I'm not sure, again, it goes back to the question Marcus had for the comptroller. Why is the commission giving fines when other people are being fined and paying restitution when they're delinquent in these other areas? It just seems a little bit like double jeopardy, especially when legislation was given to the cities and counties last session to help them with their collections. I would like to see that given some additional thought so that the permit holders are not being given a double whammy, especially right now. Many of them can't pay those fees and they're doing their best. So I would hope that would be considered.
Yeah, at the same time though, Amy, statutorily, it wasn't repealed within the alcohol beverage code for us to not take any action. And again, we only enforce by statute. We're obligated to enforce the collection of those fees and taxes, and it wasn't repealed statutorily. And so we're only doing again working in conjunction with those cities and counties to collect on their behalf.
Well, and Dexter, I apologize. You might want to unmute me. But, God, anyway, thank you, my staff. I hope, Dexter, that, again, you'll give this additional consideration just because, again, they were given their collection authority through the statute. And you all have even changed. You used to not chase down those liabilities of $10, but now you're not only chasing down those liabilities, you're going to fine them, a certain amount of money for not paying their $10 on their beverage cartage. So again, I would like to see it given some additional thought and perhaps even communications with cities and counties that are involved in these collections. Has anybody talked to any municipalities or county government about this?
Particularly Harris County. Harris County is one of the obviously largest municipalities out there. They furnished to us, quite a few of those requests to collect those city taxes and fees. And we have talked with them, and their intent is to collect what's due to their municipality. And as a result of that, they notify us that the individual entities have not paid those taxes and fees. And again, we are obligated to serve those requests for payments.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, since we've had a lot of specific questions about specific violations in this chart is not intended to create or expand upon or indicate that we're going to start enforcing more often or anything like that, any of these violations. It's just intended to capture as best as we can, the universe of regulatory violations for which we have statutory authority. That's not to say that we're going to necessarily, change anything about the way that we're enforcing them right now. We're just trying to capture it all in this one place. You know, without any statutory changes, we're not changing anything about how we interpret that statute or whether or not we have any authority. So the things that I really would like your help with, again, are making sure that we have categorized these properly based upon where you think, where the fines have historically been. I would really invite you to get down to the violation level and make your case for why something should be shifted down if you think so. And also the comment on, you know, the descriptor being not very helpful or useful. If there's something like that where you're reading it and you're going, I don't even know what the heck that means, I would really appreciate if you would let me know that as well, so we can hopefully make this chart as user-friendly as possible. All right.
All right, so one last, see, Amy had her hand up again, but I was reading here, the question says, if they are paid, are they still subject to fines? And so by statute, you know, there's a process that requires the counties and cities and those municipalities to go through a process of collections where they have to have sent notice to the permittees and try to make several attempts to collect before it even gets to us. And so we're before it gets to our desk, I mean, we're 6, 7, 8 months down the line once it becomes delinquent with the municipalities. And so I think there's, you know, ample time, you know, for those permittees and licensees to make the payments. And once we get it, again, when we make the notification, again, before we're taking, you know, formative action on them, we are still working with them trying to collect the payment on the municipality.
Have you ever fined anybody, Dexter, a permit holder?
I'd have to go and pull the data on it, to be honest with you, Amy. I can't recall right offhand.
You haven't up until 2017 that I know of. That's why.
I don't want to speak on, you know, something that without us actually pulling the statistical data on it.
Absolutely.
And even as we go forward, I mean, again, as Shana was indicating here, all these things have been available to us, and it's part of the current processes. I mean, so we're not adding anything that hasn't already been there. You know, we're basically just modifying the penalty chart and updating it into a new process. So I would encourage, you know, the industry, I mean, to not get too worked up about this segment about the fees and collection of local fees and taxes on behalf of the municipalities. I mean, we're not doing anything different than we have always been doing.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions regarding the rule, the new draft rule 34.3 in the attached graphic, the penalty policy, or the penalty calculation worksheet that you'd like to bring up right now? Okay, not seeing any raised hands or additional questions. Let's go ahead and move on to item number 3. This is the first brand new document that you've seen for today's meeting. As you know, during the legislative session, there was some pretty major changes to marketing practices to basically label approvals. And in most cases, label approvals are going to be essentially automatic if the applicant has a certificate of label approval from the federal government. Because of that relatively fundamental change, the whole chapter has actually needed quite a bit of updating and revision. And so we took this opportunity to really look at it holistically, rearrange it, remove things that are no longer applicable due to the change to the use of the COLA, And so it looks significantly different. And so we're gonna definitely want y'all to spend some time looking and making sure that it works for you and that you think it captures what, the legislature intended. I am going to turn it over to Thomas Graham to answer your questions about it. This one is not scheduled for July. If there is enough interest, if we need it, we'll definitely have another stakeholder meeting. When there's a significant interest, we try to have, and especially with more significant changes, where there are more changes to look at, we definitely try to give 2 stakeholder meetings in advance of proposal. Basically, the way we've restructured this chapter, let me just lay that out, and then I'll let Thomas take over. But we restructured the chapter to have the general provisions that are going to apply across the board at the beginning, and then we get into more specific provisions and additional subchapters. We have enforcement comes second. So first is general provisions, second is enforcement, and then we get into items in subchapter C that are specific to distilled spirits but don't apply to the other categories. Subchapter D is items, rules that are specific to malt beverages, and subchapter E is specific to wine, and I need to change that title so it's consistent with the others. So we're generally, and this is how we're, to the extent that we're rearranging things, that's sort of the idea over time, is to get general provisions up front, and then get into more specific provisions toward the end and separate subchapters. So with that said, I am going to hand it over to y'all to go ahead and ask your questions, make your comments, and we'll hopefully be able to answer them. So.
Good morning, y'all. Just to kind of give you.
Hold on just 1 second.
Oh, you don't need to move the camera, Joe. Nobody wants to see me.
No. Charles has a question.
Does he? It's not popping up for some reason on mine.
Well, Thomas, go ahead.
Go ahead, Charles.
Well,
just real quick, let me throw it out just real quick. This has gotten a lot shorter than what we had in the rule currently, because if you go look at our rules now, there's a lot of language in there that was taken out of the TTB's label language. So we went through and compared what we had in our rule book to what the TTB has, everything from advertising to prohibited statements, flags, seals, that kind of stuff. And if we had overlapping language, we took it out of our rules, which was really the intent, I think, of Sunset and the legislature this time around. So we're not just doing the same process at the feds. Yeah, we're streamlining everything. So that is kind of the process of how we got to where we are now in terms of this being much shorter and not seeing the language that was in here prior. It's because we went through and actually compared each line to the federal language, and if it was in the federal language, we pulled it out. So go ahead, Charles. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yep, sure. So kind of going back to what Shana said about after you have a COLA, that approval is basically automatic, but so if I'm a brewer and I apply for a COLA, I wait a few days for that, and then I apply to TABC with the COLA information. When can I put the product in market? Can I put it in the market after I have the COLA and have started the application with TABC, or am I actually doing duplicate processes, and waiting twice to get a product into market?
You're waiting twice, Charles. We're registering your product. So you really have to wait to get that approval from us. The way statute's written, you can't sell it without having either Texas registration for your product, is what we're going to call it now. Label approval is how it's touched on, but you can't sell it until you have that unless it's exempt, because you're selling it just in the tap room or something along this line. So that process hasn't changed. But in terms of what we're looking for on the label, that's completely changed. So the stuff that we're looking for now, we're going to be relying on the feds to do that work for us. So it should be a much shorter process. I think right now we're turning, I think the average for this last month was 7 to 8 days. And with this and the new system, I mean, you're looking at just a couple days because we're just not going to be looking for much other than you got a valid COLA, you got a valid license, and that's really about it.
I actually want to emphasize something that Thomas started his comment with, and that is wherever you used to see label approval, if you want to just replace that in your head with product registration, that is the sort of paradigm shift that we've undergone. So label approval is now product registration, and that indicates sort of the streamlining and the decreased timeline that we're expecting. We're not going to go through a full review and approval process. We're just going to be checking some boxes and registering you. Making sure that you have what the Fed, that the feds have approved you, and moving forward.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That suggests it's not an exact parallel label approval to registration. However, the fee has increased from $25 to $50 per license. Is that, and are we still required to have, COLA doesn't require a COLA per every container size, it's per label. And so are we eliminating various container sizes or just increasing the cost of the registration?
We're eliminating. So that was the direction Sunset as well. And raising the fee is going to help account for some of those costs. And we haven't raised the fee in at least 20 years or something like that. So we're kind of due to raise that fee. But in terms of the different container sizes, you're only going to need additional label approvals and additional fees from us if the feds are requiring an additional COLA. So right now, when you're paying $25 for your 12-ounce can and another $25 for your 16-ounce, you're not going to have to do that anymore. So it's just $25 per federal COLA that you're registering, or excuse me, $50 per federal COLA you're registering.
Okay. It just seems a little odd that you would be reducing manpower to effectively reducing workload but increasing fee to get the registration.
Well, it's something we've looked at doing for a long time, and it's a fee that we're supposed to have to really cover process, and we should have raised it a long time ago. I mean, it's in terms of state fees, we're pretty cheap. We're looking at other states that are around $350 a year for registration, and those expire every couple years. So we figured 25 to 50 was pretty reasonable, especially when you're going to a position where you're only going to be filing one label registration for multiple products, multiple sizes now, versus one $25 for each different size and each different label that you're putting on there.
Thanks.
If COLA has, so Tyler's question, if COLA has an allowable revision per the TTB rules, no. So we're going to follow the COLA process on that. If the TTB says you don't need a new label, a new COLA from them based on a revision, if your revision is an allowable revision, in other words, on the TTB's list, then you don't have to come back to us for a new label. We're going to follow their revision process. So if they require you to get a new label, you need to come back to us. And our rule does speak to that. I'd have to go digging through here, but that was how we wanted to do revisions. Is we're not going to mess with it. If it's under allowable revisions with the feds, then that's great. If the feds require that you need a new label, you need to come back to us and get it and re-register that product, the new product, after the revision.
Okay, there's some questions above that from.
Did I miss them? Okay. Marcus, we'll come back to you. What are the ones above it? I'm trying to find
So for Amy Harrison is asking, does this mean label applications are under the APA? The legislation has told us what to do about that. If the commission denies an application with a valid COLA or doesn't act on it within the prescribed period of time, then the applicant is entitled to a hearing under the APA before SOA. If it is one that is not, that does not have a COLA, can't get a COLA, then there is, I believe there's no right to appeal because there isn't one provided for by the statute, and I will confirm that.
Wait, okay, sorry, go ahead.
The next question, does this apply to direct shippers?
And, no, it doesn't apply to direct shippers. So under authority and scope, let me see, reduced pursuant to 109.21. And I believe it is 109.21 of the statute. I need to go look, but we covered that in this rule as well. So, direct shippers by statute are not required to have label approval with the state or to register products with the state, as long as they've registered with the feds and have
Yeah, it's actually in
valid COLA.
it's in 45.4
Of the rule.
B3. So the entire chapter doesn't apply to the things in 45.1. Product registration is not required for, in addition, for the items under 45.4. So out-of-state winery direct shippers permits, there's no product registration required. So to confirm, TABC will require COLAs for strictly intrastate product sold into retail.
Yes, so that's going to be a major change for the folks in state, the brewers and the craft brewers, that were only selling interstate or intrastate, excuse me. They weren't required to go to the feds. They could just come to TABC. But Sunset and the legislature this year said they wanted to change that, so we've changed that process. So regardless of whether it's intrastate or not, you still have to go to the federal government and register and get a COLA from them before you come to us. So for the in-state folks, the craft, the brewers and the brew pubs that are selling to retail, not only do you have to come to TABC, but you're going to have to start going to the federal government as well for a COLA when this goes into effect. While we're waiting on some other questions, one of the other things that we have done here is tried to ensure that we did a good job of covering what the TTB does not consider malt beverages, but still are considered beer under the federal laws, and then under the new definition for malt beverages after the last legislative session for Texas, regardless of whether it's got malted in it or not, if it's a beer, we're calling it a malt beverage and it's covered under this. So this does cover the products that are beers that are not going to be eligible for TTB COLA. So I asked everybody that has an interest in that, take a look at it, make sure we've covered the appropriate statutes and we're going the right direction with that, because that is a new thing that we're covering in the rule, especially since the rule is now saying, well, we're going to rely on a COLA for all of this stuff. We did have to create processes for the beers that are not going to get COLAs and for the wines. So low wines are covered in here as well, cider and other products that are under 7%. So we tried to cite some of the federal laws, well, all the federal laws. We tried to cover all of it that was necessary. So please take a look at that. If you have those products, you're familiar with that, and you can provide input. Okay, let's see. So Charles has asked if a product already has label approval, does it need to apply for a COLA? That's something we're discussing, whether or not we're going to require that. It's not something we would really want to do. We don't want to go back and make everyone register that. So at this point, I don't want to say that is, whether it's intent or not, we don't want to have to require everyone to go get a COLA that doesn't have one. What we've decided at this point and moving forward is that when you change that label, that you have with us or you register a new product, then you're gonna come forward. But your products that are already in the market for those intrastate beers that did not have colas, you don't need to go register them once this is in effect.
Right, so I think where we came down on that was that, if there's, if you have a change, it's an allowable revision from under the TTB's guidelines, then there's no need to go get a COLA. But if it's a change that is outside of those allowable revisions, then we would have to, get a COLA and register again. And yes, I think that's a good ad, that's an applicability ad, so I'll look at adding that.
Sounds good. Thank you, Charles. Okay. Amy has asked if I go through each one of these, and I don't want to miss anything, so Jana, jump in if there's something that I'm missing. So Shana pointed out at the beginning that we've broken this out into general provisions that apply to all, enforcement, application, and then specifics for each product type and the rules that are in there. So authority and scope, this lays out our authority under 101.67 for malt beverages and 671 for spirits and wine. We talk about in this section that we cover the fact that products, distilled spirits used for industrial purposes don't have to have label approval. We talk about 109.21, which I believe is the direct shippers piece of that, where it says label registration is not required. Wine that's to be exported in bond, so that these are all things that are not new changes, but we are making sure that we're laying them out in one spot here in the beginning in the authority and scope. And then malt beverages manufactured for sale exclusively outside of the U.S. So, of course, brewers in the state, or outside of Texas, brewers in state that are making products that are never going to go to the Texas marketplace, but maybe going to Oklahoma, you're not going to be required to come to us for those. So, and that's covered in statute already. Then we go into our definitions.
I see a comment here from Marcus that we need to do add a minimum ABV of 0.5%, because the upper end is there but no lower end. I see that comment.
Okay.
I'm making a note.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And in these definitions where we're going to need to add that, we still have ale and beer in here, of course, and then in 21 we'll pull that out, and it'll all just become malt beverages, just for clarity. But for now, that language is in here. Trying to decide how detailed to go into each one of these. So we got all of our definitions there. If there's any questions about that, it looks like Amy has a question about bottlers. A bottler, any person, not wine or spirits, which places malt beverages. Yeah, we need to go through and make sure that we covered that, but.
I think we discussed this.
Did we?
It's something that the beer guys.
Okay.
It was something from, and I actually don't even know that term is used in, let's see.
I think we had some of that term
Yeah,
in the rule.
any producer, bottler of wine, yeah. There's some history to that we didn't change it, based upon where it came from, and
I think because we had some bottler language in the rule, and then a lot of the bottler for the spirits and the wine is so heavily regulated by the feds, we kind of left it at that. But
right. Well, we'll take a second look at that.
Yes.
And you'll see, actually, I searched through the rule, and we do use the term bottler with respect to the other types of beverages as well. So
We just need to update it.
yeah.
Okay, and just following along, I mean, 45.3 is a general prohibition that you can't sell anything, alcohol in the state unless it falls under, unless you have label approval, unless it's exempt. Then we talk about registration, when it's required and when it's not required. If you go to 45, 4B, we talk about brewer's permits authorized to sell directly to consumers. So this is that tap room exemption. If you're selling direct to the consumer and you're a brewer in your tap room, under the new statute 101-6701, you're not required to obtain label approval. One of the things that we did is we added in 2. So to ensure that we're doing the same for brew pubs, we added in language saying that if a brew pub is selling direct to the consumer, then they are exempt from label approval as well. That is actually not covered in statute. Under 101-6701, the new language really just spoke to brewers and manufacturers. But by practice, the state has allowed for products that are being sold directly to the consumer in a brew pub. We have not required label approval for those. So we wanted to ensure that we put that in the rule, and then we may have to look at other cleanup language later. And then, of course, the out-of-state direct shipper's permit, if you hold a permit there. Denial of product registration. So this is going to be new to some degree. As part of the last legislative session, sunset, and the legislature said, TABC, you need to have the authority to deny wine and spirits the same way you do currently with malt beverages. So as a result of that, we now have the authority to do so. We can deny a product registration for wine, spirits, and beer. And so this covers how we would go about doing that. And at this point, under 45.5, we are just citing what the statute says. Doesn't meet the federal requirements for label approval. We would deny something like that. In 2, we say would create a cross-tier violation, and I'll come back to that. And then we have obscene and indecent in here as well. And then we cover public safety concerns, which is out of statute, and then any other section of the code, which is also new language in the statute. So for cross-tier violations, and we can come back to it here in a minute.
Let me, just
well,
before
let's
you
look
go
at
on,
what she's got.
before
Yeah.
you go into that, I wanted to say, so this list of 5 reasons for denying product registration, it's an exclusive list. So this is the 5 reasons that can be cited for denial. That's all. Go ahead. Oh, and then the question about obscenity or indecency, there's nothing that's going to change about how that is.
The process.
Right, the process for reviewing that and what the sort of limits of that are, and I guess it's one of those pornography, you know, when you see it, things. And if there's anything else you want to.
Well, I mean, currently for malt beverages, we follow that process, and it goes through review through legal staff. They look at it, provide an opinion, and then a decision is made as to whether or not it's indecent or obscene. Of course, under the new statute, new rule, if the applicant disagrees with us on our position there, they've got the ability to appeal that through SOA. Okay, where did we leave off? We also have cross-tier violations on here, and in the reasons that we would deny a product, this has come up several times, so I just want to be clear. And when we get back further in the rule, if you look at wine and spirits, we're using the same language. We're not going into any more detail in terms of what a cross-tier violation is. However, for the malt beverage section, we have carried over the language from the current rules that prohibit private labels or labels made for a retailer. So what we're doing at this point is kind of status quo with regard to control labels or private labels. We've included the statutory language, the new statutory language about cross-tier violations in the rule, but we have not gone into private label prohibitions in detail or anything like that under wine and spirits. Whereas in beer, we just brought over the language in the current rule that prohibits private labels. We're not intending to address that now. I think what we're going to do is be waiting till next session before we really do anything with wine and spirit control labels. That's a discussion. If you've been part of it, it's an ongoing discussion. It's my understanding the legislature had an interim study this off-season, you could say, for it as well. So we'll see what happens next session before we go into that. As far as our processes, once this goes into effect, it's going to be status quo for the time being.
Thomas, I have a quick question while you're there, if you can hear me, please.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
go ahead.
So, private label and control brands, you brought over the malt beverage. You didn't, it's my understanding, in the strategic plan that the commission just adopted is an entire section on private and control brand in the strategic plan that basically leads me to understand that because the genie's out of the bottle, you're not enforcing any of these. So how does that, under current enforcement and what's happening with private and control brands, how does that equate to the adoption of this rule, and what would change with that? Is my question. I'm sorry, and if that's
No.
but
I-
I'm getting kind of cross vibes when I read the strategic plan and the fact that there's thousands and thousands out there, and then I read that malt beverage was brought back over. So are we trying to loosen up private and control? Are we not loosening up? Is it going to be for all brands? Are different products going to be singled out? I'm confused, please.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because it's been a while since I've been allowed out of the house, so speaking clearly and explaining that is something I'm going to need to work on. But that's what I meant by status quo. And I think the strategic plan explains that right now there are a lot of wine and spirits products in the marketplace because we did not have the authority since the 2007 sunset legislation. We were not denying wine and spirits labels that were private labels because we did not have the authority to deny anything that was a wine and spirit that had a cola. Whereas with malt beverages we did. And so we actually have rules that explicitly lay out or specifically lay out what a private label is for a malt beverage and that we should deny it. What I meant by status quo, and I think what the strategic plan talks about, is as a result of that 2007 legislative change, there were tons of wine and spirit private labels that made it into the marketplace. And then fast forward to today, last session, since the legislature said, we want you to have that authority to deny products in that marketplace. So we are in a position where we're saying, yes, there's a ton of wine and spirits out there. There are no private labels for beer because we can deny those. So we're going to keep that status quo and go into the next legislative session to see, and we're kind of asking for some help there. What's the guidance for us on what we need to do? And we have some different options, but as I mentioned before, there's an interim study going on speaking to private labels about private labels, and I think we're waiting to see what comes out of that going into next session before we make any changes, whether we open it up or start denying wine and spirits products. I'm not sure that we could at this point open it up. If it's a cross-tier violation, it's a cross-tier violation. I think that's why we're hoping to hear from the legislature, hoping the industry talks to the legislature and helps work on a solution on how to handle those products. And what do we do? Take them out of the market, or by pursuing administrative cases and start denying products on the front end, or is there another solution that the legislature has in mind?
So just in response to that, I sent you some photos, which I don't want to call out online, and the application added, your label application added, is this a logo or a this, that, or chicken fat for a retailer? Answer yes or no. And in that situation, I have no idea what they answered, but they got approved. So is that an example of cross-tier? Does that question no longer have any bearing? And if so, why is it still on the application? I see all of these distilled and wine spirits out there, and it appears as though you're approving them even when you have a question on the application that says, is this? And if you look at the label, it's pretty evident it is, especially when the girls are posing with the bottle with the same t-shirt on. So I just wonder if we're not doing that and malt beverages are, I just hope there's going to be some kind of equity between the products. But I appreciate your concern.
Yeah, and I think these are all issues that, like Thomas was saying, we're looking for a little bit more direction from the legislature before we make any changes to how we're operating. And right now, all we're doing is just putting that authority into the rule. So just using the straight up statutory language, not doing anything to interpret or expand upon it, just adding that statutory language into our rule as one of the reasons that we could deny, and then we'll wait for some additional guidance and to really do if we are going to make any changes.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we just want to make sure that as we're adopting the rules, that authority is accounted for in there.
If we see a wine and spirit that has a violation on it, or they check that box, Amy, it goes to audit for investigation, and they work those pretty diligently.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Time limitation, so revocation of registration. This is something that is a little bit new. The commission may revoke product registration at any time if the registration was granted in error. If the commission receives new information supporting a denial under 45.5 or was subject to conditions. This is just kind of clarifying our processes, but if we let's say by error, we end up approving a label that did not have a COLA and should have, this gives us the authority to come back and revoke that approval on our end. This is the time limitation piece that was also put in by the last legislative session. We have to, not later than 30 days after we receive the application, make a decision. And then the protest process that Shana spoke about earlier.
Hold on for just 1 second. We've got a question from Marcus. Suppose an application is submitted in full, the commission comes back with an additional request. Is this told a 30-day limitation? So if there's an additional request, then it's not submitted in full.
Right.
Those are mutually exclusive things. So because an application has to include not only what's required on the form, but also any other information the commission requests. That's basically the definition of an application. So if we come back with an additional request, it's not considered finally submitted until the date that request is fulfilled. And then the 30 days starts then.
Then we talk about withdrawal of the application, that of course you can withdraw your application at any time. Application fee and the change in that, raising it to $50. 4511 is when reapplication is applied or required, and this covers Tyler's questions earlier about a federal COLA, and essentially it says if you're required to get a new federal COLA by the TTB, then you would have to get a new state registration as well.
Let me answer. Amy has a question again about how the applicant's going to know when the 30-day time clock starts.
Our system is going to track that.
Our system's going to track it. You'll have the dashboard. Before that, we'll check our procedures, but I would think that you would get a notification from the person processing that they have everything they need. If that needs to be in an email or something in writing, then
and Ames is going to do that.
Yeah, Ames is going to do it, and before that happens, perhaps an email.
We'll follow the current process. You'll have an email that comes from us.
Okay.
To start the date. Yeah. And then this reapplication required piece, essentially, we also created this list for B, which is the folks that are not having to get a COLA because they can't qualify for one, i.e. low wines or beer products that are not malt beverages, and thus TTB is not going to issue a COLA for. These are the allowable revisions. We just took that out of the federal language in terms of what those allowable revisions are, more or less, and put them in here. So we're not going to require people that have a beer product that are COLA exempt to come back in and reapply every time they make a small change to their label. We're trying to give as much as we can for allowable exemptions on those products as well. So that's covered there. we also, as part of the sunset legislation, were required to have a process for approving labels, should we have another federal government shutdown. And this kind of goes into detail on that in 45.12. Okay, we got another question from Charles. If for some reason TABC doesn't approve a registration within 30 days, does it automatically become approved and the product can go to market? And
No.
Marcus is hitting on statute there, and he says 45, which is the way the statute's written. Yeah. Is that not right?
45 what?
45 days, or did we
45
get to 30th day? Later than 30th, shall you approve? Sorry, yeah, 45.12. 45 is what was being negotiated, then it went to 30. But Charles, I'm pretty sure that's laid out in statute as, yes, at 30 days we have to approve it. But I'll make sure we clarify.
Yeah, and right here on the time limitation, that's something that I can, add to 45.7. I'm adding that as a task. If it's in the, sometimes if things are in statute, we don't necessarily repeat them in rule, but that would make sense to repeat in the rule just for clarity. And of course, if it's one with a COLA and we fail to act within 30 days, you have it does not go into effect automatically because you have the right to request a hearing. So I'm only thinking if it's one without a COLA, then it might be.
I see what you're saying. We went back and forth.
Let me go back to the statute and see, Marcus.
That may be, yeah, I know it's in statute, Charles and Marcus, so let's look at that and we'll clarify it in here. I can't remember because it changed so many times in the bill. No, I don't remember. Get confused.
Sorry, Charles.
Source energy fast. If reapplication is necessary, will another fee be required? And Marcus says, if reapplication is necessary, will another fee be required? And the answer is yes. It'd be a new registration. So if you make an amendment to your label and it doesn't fall within the TTB allowable revisions, you do have to pay another label registration fee with the state to get it re-registered. Okay, so Amy says the statutory 30-day decision is required. Okay.
But the consequence of that is if you have a COLA and we don't act in that amount of time, that you have an opportunity for hearing. I guess the other option would be the mandamus or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If a mandamus action. I can't imagine that being necessary, but I think that would be your method of redress. If you're one that has a valid COLA, you can request a hearing at SOA. If you are someone who's not eligible for a COLA, you would have to, I suppose, request a mandamus or file a mandamus action to district court.
Okay, Amy says if you have a revision, if you pay a fee and revision was not required, will you give a refund? We're not giving any refunds. So 45.110 says, there are no refunds for applications. And that process is already in place for labels because it's a processing fee. It's not really like a license fee where it's if you get the license and you have paid for it, but if we didn't issue the license, then we'll give your money back. It's a processing fee.
The work is being done.
Yeah. So we're keeping your money. All right. Let me keep going to enforcement. So the enforcement language, like 45.120, showing your certificate to a commission representative, we pulled that out of our current rules and kind of cleaned it up a little bit and also kind of aligned it with to make sure each product and the rules we use are the same. But you have to show us your product. Examination and testing a product. So this is also part of the new statutory language and what we were required to do. We're not testing products anymore, obviously, on the front end. But this speaks to the authority of us going out into the marketplace and testing products for alcohol content or whatever it may be after they've already been approved. And so that's what 45.21 and some of these other ones go into. Additional provisions for wine. This language is in current rule. We made sure we left it in here, moved it over, cleaned it up. Alteration of labels, that's in current rule as well, and there's language similar to it in the federal law that just says you can't go out and change the label, alter it without going through the right process. In records retention, so records retention here is speaking to the manufacturers out there and the requirement that they keep records showing what their laboratory testing results were for alcohol content. So if you're going to put 8% alcohol by volume on your label, as part of the last legislative session, that new legislation that came out of it, you are required to keep records to show that you've done that. And if we get a complaint that maybe your product doesn't match what's on the label in terms of content, it's part of the process where we're not testing on the front end. Well, we are required to come in on the back end and do some testing. So if we get a complaint, we're going to want to see your records to show that you did go through some kind of laboratory procedure to test the alcohol content before you put it on your product. And at that time, we want to see your records showing, yes, we did go through that. We do know that it really was 8% or whatever it was, and here's how. So this talks about keeping those records. This other language, again, we moved this forward. We also, this damaged stock language that's in there, this talks about product that's in the marketplace that the labels have been damaged, and we just moved over some of that language from current rule. So subchapter C, distilled spirit specific requirements. There are no exceptions for distilled spirits about this when it comes into the market, or there are no exceptions for getting a COLA for distilled spirits. If it's a distilled spirit, you have to get a federal COLA. That's federal law. So this talks about that. It's pretty straightforward on distilled spirits, pretty short and sweet. Let's see. Am I missing anything on there? No. Malt beverages, and the specific requirements for malt beverages are broken out. This still has language about brewers permit, non-resident brewers, manufacturers, non-resident beer, ale. That will all become brewers license and non-resident brewers license, and all all malt beverage under the new law.
Can you touch on subsection E?
Yeah.
What that does?
Skip forward to E.
No, 40. Registration E, yeah.
Yeah. So E, Shana wanted me to make sure I touched on E in this. Labels for beverages that meet the definition of a malt beverage but are ineligible for COLA. So the new definition for malt beverage for Texas includes all malt beverages that aligns with federal law, but it also includes non-malt beverage beers. So a product that's made without malt. Beers that are made without malt that fall under the definition, federal definition of beer, but don't necessarily get a COLA. TTB will not issue a COLA for those products because they're not malt beverages. So we quoted the different federal statutes in here.
Regs, yeah.
Go ahead.
And rules.
And rules that govern what has to be on a label for beer. And those are the beers that don't get a COLA and are not considered malt beverage. So that comes out of the IRC code, some FDA language. So if you're making products that are a malternative,
Did you just say malternative?
I did. I said malternative, or seltzer, or those kind of things. Please look at this. Look at E. Make sure that we have covered that well. Shana and Matthew Cherry and several others put a lot of work into making sure we got all the right federal statutes and rules quoted there. But that's what we're going to require. If you're going to apply for registration, we're going to require that you do adhere to those federal laws. So you're going to need to tell us that you did.
And then here's our
additional denial stuff.
Right. So this is just the language that already existed for essentially the private label for malt beverage. So there's nothing new here. We've just moved it into the section specific to malt beverage. And we're not intending to enforce it in any different way. Misbranding, again, just moved over from existing rules. subchapter E on wine, there's some, minor differences from the general. So we've got a separate section here for them as well. And specifically, if you'll look down at subsection D, our low wines that are ineligible for a COLA, we've done the same thing as we did for alternatives, must adhere to the labeling requirements that the feds put forth. So that's how we've covered those of you who have products, or those of your products that aren't COLA eligible under the heading of wine. We are coming up on noon, so rather than extend past 2 hours, I am going to suggest that we take items 4 and 5, which are both new, and put those off either to a rescheduled date or possibly to the August stakeholder meeting that we are already planning to have. So keep your eyes peeled for an announcement regarding the rescheduling of discussion of items 4 and 5. That said, are there any additional comments or questions in the last few minutes on this, on item number 3, the marketing practices, product registration rules? Is that new? Yes. I think, Amy, you're unmuted.
I just want to say thank you, and I know that I've caused you to run longer than you have in the past with all of my interaction, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I'm dealing with retailers who are trying to keep their doors open, and some of this is very, very complicated, and they really just don't have the time to take to understand it. So I appreciate the time that you're spending with us to help us to understand so that we can relay it to some of those people who are in dire straits right now. But this has incredible impact on them. So if there is a way to get more information out and have them time to digest it during this before July, before it's proposed, or if that can be postponed because of our current situation, I think that would be something that would be very much appreciated if taken into consideration. And I just want to say again, thank you for all of your time, and I apologize for my wordiness today.
We appreciate participation. Like I said, we're up to 61 participants. I feel like it's Facebook likes. Like the more I get, the more excited I am. Wait, somebody just signed out. Don't do that. So I'm really grateful that you're all here today, and I'm really grateful for your participation. These are, a lot of things are just rearranging and essentially implementing statutory changes, but they do look different because we're trying to streamline as we go and improve things on a holistic basis as we go. So I appreciate that there's a lot to look at. I think that's, they hired me before all of everything happened, before 2020 happened, anticipating all of this work and anticipating that we'd have a lot of work to do this year. And we're going forward on our schedule is partially dictated by legislative deadlines, and otherwise we're trying to be sensitive to what's going on in the industry right now. I have good friends that are in the industry, and I understand. I've heard and I hear from all of you about the struggles, and I know. So we're definitely doing the best we can, and always open to suggestions, and truly appreciate y'all getting in on the front end of these rules and giving us your comments and concerns so that we can get them in the best possible shape before they're ever brought before the commission for proposal. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out to me privately after this, and we'll continue to work on these to make them even better. Tyler's question, would TABC consider stair-stepping the raise and registration fee over a couple of years? Yes, we'll consider that. That will be something that will be a question for executive management, and something that we can bring to them. All right, and with that, we will sign off, and everyone stay safe and have a great weekend. Thank you.